I've always said that it doesn't really matter what kind of camera you use, but I'd never really tested out the high-end ones. So I went to Video Europe in London because they said I could spend the day with an expensive camera. So we started setting up the Arri Alexa Mini, which costs tens of thousands and has been used on all kinds of mainstream films. Then right next to it, my Canon T3i, which is generally regarded as a beginner's camera and costs a few hundred. The question is, how much worse is the cheap one? So this was shot on the expensive camera, and unsurprisingly it's a very detailed image and I really like how it handles the colour. Then we moved the Alexa out of the way and set up the same shot on the T3i, with the same lens, in the same light, and this is what it looked like. It's definitely softer, almost looks out of focus in comparison. Also, I think the Alexa's red looks richer than the kind of flat crimson of the DSLR. But filming static objects in a close-up is not a very good test, so this wide shot will be much better at showing the difference. On the left is the T3i and on the right is the Alexa, which very clearly has more detail, especially if you look at that chain link fence. Now I should point out that the way I color graded these was to make the Alexa footage look as good as possible, and then afterwards I graded the DSLR footage to match it. So it's not a truly scientific test, more of a comparison of what's possible with each camera. Okay, so the DSLR is definitely softer than the 4K Alexa footage, but what I'm more interested in is how they handle difficult lighting situations. For this shot, I stood under an overhanging building, so the background was much brighter than I was. But then we opened the aperture on the Alexa until we could actually see my face properly. Now, this is an example of what traditionally bad lighting looks like. The background is way too bright and the light is mostly on the edge of my face. But even so, with the Alexa we can see what's going on in the background. It's just very bright. Whereas the T3i in the same lighting completely clips the white on the building. Especially here on the road, it goes from grey to complete white in a very unnatural way. So the Alexa definitely has a nicer highlight roll-off. It makes the bright bits look more natural. But if I was shooting this for real and I wanted to brighten my face, I would just move away from whatever's blocking all of the light. So we just turned everything around, and now the background was much darker and the light was coming from in front. From just spinning around, both cameras look much better. Even though it's the same location and still natural light, the DSLR can handle it no problem at all. So a cheap camera with good lighting usually looks better than an expensive camera with bad lighting. So then we got some other random test shots, and what I've noticed is that the colours are fairly similar. I'd say the main difference is the sharpness, and it's most noticeable when we do side-by-side comparisons like this. Next is probably the highlights. On the DSLR, I do have to watch out for bright spots, whereas the Alexa can usually handle it fine. And if we look closely, we can see the DSLR occasionally has trouble with aliasing, like you can see on my eyebrow here, whereas the Alexa obviously doesn't. And lastly, if you move the DSLR very quickly, there will be a slight skewing from the rolling shutter, but it's never bothered me too much. But I should also point out that the Alexa records higher frame rates for slow motion, has built-in ND filters, and plenty of other little features that are really helpful on large-scale productions. On the other hand, it's much bigger and heavier than the T3i, and literally 100 times more expensive. So I can totally understand why a multi-million-dollar film would rent a camera like this. And during the shoot, I won't lie, the Alexa was a lot of fun to film with. Seeing how crisp the image was and appreciating that carbon fiber design. But once I color graded the footage, I was actually pleasantly surprised by how similar the T3i looks, so long as we've got half decent lighting. That's my opinion, but if you want to download the original test footage before I color graded it, there's a link in the description so you can play around with it and decide for yourself. So thanks again to Video Europe for letting me borrow the equipment. My name is Cade, this has been DSLR Guide, and I'll see you next week.